Typically, the way that this class is designed or written, it's part of FPMT's curriculum, and they've sort of designed it as a 4 or potentially 5 week class, depending on how you can do it in 4 weeks as we normally do. This would be the third week in that 4 week series, as you saw on the website with the dates. But people haven't no one's been to the previous 2 classes, so there haven't been 2 previous iterations of this series. So typically, the information builds from class 1 all the way through class 4. If you'd like, I can just present class 1, today, and then we can do class 2 next week. We do have to switch after that, because there's another every month on Fridays we switch the introductory class. So Buddhism in a Nutshell starts in November, starts in November. So with Venerable Katie. So she's doing Buddhism in a Nutshell in November. But it's also true that on the YouTube page, we have past, this class has been done before, and, there's past whole, series of, so if you'd like, you can watch the other classes. If you do come back next week, we could cover the first 2 classes, and then you could watch, say, like class 3, class 4 on YouTube. Because it's all, it's largely the same material that's covered.
Sure.
Okay. So, as I say, we'll begin with class 1. So this is Meditation 101, and its purpose is to help practitioners, or not even practitioners, because it doesn't assume that a person knows anything about Buddhism. It doesn't, it's for complete beginners. So it's about people who may have some interest in Buddhism, or somebody who's been meditating for a while and maybe would like a little bit more structured information about how to establish a daily practice at home. There are some meditations, but mainly the purpose of the course is to help. It's not a class that is primarily group meditation. It's primarily a class that's designed to help a person understand how to start or grow a practice on their own at home. Okay, so as I said, the title of the class is Meditation 101, and our center, Thupten Norbu Ling, is a Tibetan Buddhist center. So the information that we present is particularly coming from that lineage, rather than, say, a Theravadan center or a mindfulness center. We are particularly presenting Tibetan Buddhism. FPMT's mission, we are, as I say, an FPMT center, which means we are affiliated with an international organization called FPMT, the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, FPMT. And they were established really to present Tibetan Buddhism for an audience that may not have an existing cultural connection to Tibetan Buddhism. There are many Tibetan Buddhist centers that are trying to recreate how Buddhism is practiced in a particular country with sort of all of the cultural packaging that is there. And FPMT's mission is to sort of not do that, to transmit the essence of Tibetan Buddhism, but not the emphasis on the cultural trappings or packaging that you might find in a center that's going to be largely populated by practitioners from a particular country, like, a Korean center or what have you. So, yeah. But given that we are coming from that particular lineage, the word meditation in Tibetan is the word gom, Gom, which, if you were to translate into English, is most closely the word to familiarize, the verb to familiarize. And particularly, what we want to familiarize our mind with is virtue. Um, all day, every day, we are creating familiarities. We are developing greater associations. However, not all of those are virtuous. Sometimes we are practicing anger. Sometimes we're practicing, um, you know, attachment, which means like having a greedy mind, a mind that feels like we need to possess things that seem pleasant. So all day, every day, we're already habituating or familiarizing the mind. But we're not necessarily taking time out of our day to intentionally familiarize or habituate the mind with virtue. And that's really the point of meditation from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. So we'll see that one particular type or form of meditation that's very common and very emphasized in Tibetan Buddhism is called analytical meditation, which is when we have a particular topic and we analyze that topic with a calm, concentrated mind. Yes, you have a question.
So my question with the analytical meditation is, this is one of the reasons why I feel like I need 101, is I am learning shamatha meditation, right? One of the things that confuses me is like analytical meditation and like mindfulness, being aware. So like with analytical meditation, my thing is, when do you say there's a problem that's arised, right? When do you solve that? Like, is that called analytical meditation? Like a problem arise, like anger arose, and at that time I wasn't able to address the anger, but now, I come home and is that what analytical meditation is? I sit down and I think about why was the anger and what happened? Or is analytical meditation scripted in these are, you know, four things that you sit and you meditate: death and impermanence, death and impermanence, empathy, compassion. I don't know, I'm just like kind of randomly popcorning things. I'm so confused what analytical is, because in my head, analytical is like, okay, something's happened. Now you have to sit down and get into your mind and figure out what happened. Why did you react the way it did? And you didn't have a calm mind. I'm sorry I rambled a bit, but I just have to really understand this.
Yeah, no, so definitely there are different uses for analytical meditation. It can come up in different ways. Um, in If a person studies Tibetan Buddhism in a deeper, more formal way, then they're going to, and this is something that if you take Buddhism in a nutshell, because Meditation 101 focuses on meditation and not so much general Buddhist philosophy, whereas Buddhism in a nutshell focuses more on general Buddhist philosophy and not so much the meditation. So the two classes are they go together. It's kind of FPMT's idea about what a person would do is that they would take both. So if a person engages in Tibetan Buddhism with more seriousness, then quickly they will come across what's called the Lam Rim, or the stages of the path to enlightenment. that's sort of the closest thing that you could find to like the Buddhist Bible from the Tibetan perspective. It is a condensed version of all of the public discourses of the Buddha as they were eventually written down in the sutras. But then, of course, the sutras are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. And the Lam Rim is an effort to condense that into maybe just a few hundred pages. So that is oftentimes for a more formal practitioner, that will be the foundation of their practice, is taking those topics and meditating on them analytically. So as you mentioned, like death and impermanence is a major topic of the Lam Rim. And there's different ways of breaking that big topic into individual sessions of meditation where you're trying to familiarize your mind with specifically and exactly what it was that the Buddha taught about that topic. How did the Buddha present death and impermanence? And how do we, in our own mind, generate the same insight that the Buddha had in his mind about that topic? Because that's all that the Buddha did. He had insights, and then he explained what those insights were. And if you're interested, here's the method for also cultivating those insights in your own mind. And so the Lam Rim is really the heart of a person's practice if they decide to engage in a pretty formal way with Tibetan Buddhism. It's also the case, as you mentioned, if a person has maybe a more general interest and they recognize that, anger is a problem, it's a problem for everyone. Everyone struggles with anger to one degree or another. So a person in general might just be motivated to do something about that. And they could find wisdom about that in the Lam Rim, of course. They could also use analytical meditation in a bit of a more general way, which would be, as you're saying, like later that day, to replay what happened, you're bopping along and everything is fine. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, and then instantly you move into a not so positive way of responding. So then in meditation later that day, you could think of, okay, well, what else could I have done? Now that question is also answered in various ways in the Lam Rim, in different commentaries, in various texts, in a person's study. But a person could think on their own too, like, what would have been better? How could I better have responded? And then you could pretend in meditation that you did that you remained calm, that you brought to mind, maybe just the wish, maybe thinking, well, sometimes I also cut people off in traffic. And it's not because I'm a terrible person, it's because maybe I'm really stressed, or maybe I'm trying to get somewhere to help someone who is in distress and I can't really manage, I'm rushing, or I'm just late and I'm kind of, I'm an ordinary person, and so I'm late and I didn't have the spaciousness of mind to kind of check who's behind me and who's around me, because I kind of had a sort of temporarily more myopic view. So just like me, they have reasons why they did that. And it's not because they didn't like me. It's not because they saw me and they had a thought of ill will that they were trying to cause me harm. So there are things that we can say to ourselves in that moment that help to reduce that angry response. We can think, I really hope they get where they're going safely. They seem like they're really in a hurry. They seem like there's something really stressful going on. I really just wish them well, and I hope that they can get where they're going safely. That's a much more peaceful, even like in our own mind, because the afflictions like anger, like you're saying, they're painful for oneself, which is one way that we can know that an affliction is arising, because it agitates our own mind. Like if we could, if we imagine thinking that really happy thought toward them in that moment, it's fun, it's nice, it's peaceful, it's calm, it's enjoyable, even for oneself in that moment, as compared to flipping them off, hoping that they get into a car accident, thinking how dare they, you know, those are agitating, disturbing, painful states of in our own mind. So even if we're just interested in being more peaceful, just internally, then we need to find ways of replacing angry thoughts with kind thoughts, with loving thoughts, with compassionate thoughts. So it's really kind of up to the person to sort of answer your question. If a person chooses, if they really gravitate to the texts, to the formal historical presentations, then there's lots of contemplations that they will find there about how to do that, how to engage in that. But, there are certainly people who want to have a meditation practice. They see the value of meditation. They, but they're probably never going to like read the Lam Rim. They're not really going to, go to formal classes. So they can kind of come up with their own answers, their own kind of like, what should I do? What could I do? What would have been better? And the theory is, as I mentioned, meditation is familiarization. The theory that underlies this whole process is that the reason that we naturally, spontaneously, initially gave rise to that aggressive thought is because we've practiced that a lot, not from the Buddhist perspective, not only just in this life, but from the Buddhist perspective over beginningless past lives, because it's easier. It's sort of the path of least resistance. It's, we find it easy to go through life putting ourselves at the center of our own story, and interpreting everything through the lens of how does this impact my day? How does this relate to my interests, my desires, my preferences? So we have this unspoken subconscious view that I should just be able to get where I'm going without anybody cutting me off in traffic, even though that's unrealistic, even though that's a thing that happens to everyone every day. We wouldn't say it out loud. We wouldn't, actually express, but unconsciously we have this perspective that I ought to be able to always get in my car and never have to deal with thoughtless, careless driving, etc. And that's kind of the view that we use to interpret all of our experiences. It's the default perspective. In Buddhism, they call that the view of self-grasping and self-cherishing. Self-cherishing sounds like a positive thing from our, Western mind, but it isn't just taking care of oneself. It's putting oneself above all others. It isn't. It's not. Buddhism isn't saying that we ought not do psychologically healthy things or to take care of oneself. But Buddhism is suggesting we ought not have the view that we're more important than any other sentient being. That's kind of a mistaken view. And they call that self-cherishing. So it's a technical term that means that. And they say that yes.
Yeah, I actually thank you for clarifying. I'm glad it's just me right now because I just ask all these questions. Because there's
Sure.
so many things that you're saying that just like as you're speaking is just clarifying my questions. So, for example, is then when I see the word analytical meditation, does that mean lam rim? Because when I hear that, I'm thinking, oh, like when these afflicted emotions come, then you sit and meditate what happened. But it sounds like when the term analytical meditation is used, it's used in the context of the lam rim. Is
Mhm.
is that what I'm thinking?
So it really is often, in terms of the Lam-Rim, it's analytical meditation plays an indispensable role in being able to deeply internalize the wisdom of the Lam-Rim. So in Buddhism, there are what are called the three wisdoms, which is how we are meant to approach our study. There's the wisdom that arises through listening, which is sort of a surface level of understanding. And on that level, we are trying to understand, like, what does this word mean? What does impermanence mean? What does karma mean? What are the definitions of things? So it's just kind of, because there's a Hindu understanding of karma, there's a Buddhist understanding of karma, there's a colloquial English understanding of impermanence, there's a very technical Buddhist definition of impermanence. And so if we're not clear on what everything means, then we can't, if we're using our own, if we just think, oh yeah, I know what impermanence means. It means things won't last forever, right? That's what we think it means. But that's not what it means from the Buddhist perspective. Impermanence from the Buddhist perspective means that which changes moment by moment by moment. It doesn't imply or infer that it won't last forever. Because the mind, for example, is something that changes moment by moment by moment. But from the Buddhist perspective, it is beginningless and endless. There's no force in the universe that can cease, that can cause the mind to cease. The mind can't cease. And so the mind is impermanent but eternal. For many things, it is true that the fact that they change moment by moment by moment will result in their ceasing to function at a certain point. And then when they cease to function, we no longer call them what we previously called them. Like if you have a broken laptop, you don't say, well, that's my laptop, right? Because it doesn't perform the function of a laptop. You would say that's junk, that's trash, I have to throw that, I'm going to go recycle that, I'm going to throw that away. But you wouldn't be like, yeah, that's my laptop, because the idea of my laptop is something that by definition functions as a laptop. Um, and at a certain point, simply by turning it on, turning it off, at a certain point, it will break, it will cease to function. So for many things, the fact that they change, and so each time you turn it on, even by just being exposed to hot and cold and humidity, it is changing moment by moment by moment. There are no two even nanoseconds in the continuity of a laptop that are the same, because there's an electron that is no longer there from one nanosecond to another nanosecond. Um, and and at some point, simply that will cause it to break. It will no longer perform its function. But the word itself does not mean that, because there are phenomena that are eternal but impermanent. And if we don't understand that, then we'll have a wrong understanding of what the Buddha taught, and we'll never generate the actual insights that the Buddha had. So if that's our goal, it's really important that we get all of the definitions very clear. So that's the first wisdom, is the wisdom of listening, or you could say reading, the wisdom of like just the clarity of the words themselves. And then there's the wisdom that arises through contemplation. And this is like, well, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? How does that relate to the next topic? How do those two topics relate to the third topic? How does this relate back to the Four Noble Truths? How does this fit into a larger framework? What does this mean for my own practice? You're reflecting critically on what you're studying. You're asking questions. You're trying to figure out what's not clear, what don't I understand, what questions do I have, what isn't making sense for me, how do I get more information in order to clarify my doubts, etc. And then the third level is the wisdom that arises through meditation. So that is where you are literally sitting in meditation, trying to, in a room that's relatively free of distraction, trying to focus, So when you're reading, you may get up and answer the phone. When you're critically reflecting, you might answer the door. The dog might bark and you might take the dog out. It's different. When you're meditating, you're not supposed to do any of those things. I mean, if something's on fire, then, sure, you put out the fire. Otherwise, you're really supposed to carve out time and sit and not get up until, your session is over. And you're giving yourself the instruction of not following any mental distractions either. So, yes.
So I've been practicing this where I'm sitting down and not following any of the mental distractions and when I do, is it helpful for me to say, oh, during my meditation, um, when I find myself, oh, my mind went off, and do I say thinking or planning? Do I label how my mind got carried away onto a thought, and it just went until I became aware, oh, and do I say thinking and then bring my mind back to my breath? Is that a technique I should be doing, or do I just recognize it and then bring it back swiftly to my breath without labeling it?
Yeah, that particular technique, I don't think arose in the Tibetan culture. You find teachers, who will present that as a technique. Generally, within the Tibetan context, generally what they'll say is just, we start with the intention to stay on the object. We kind of give ourselves that instruction at the beginning. We set that as the goal. And then we just simply, as soon as we've noticed that that anything other than the intended object is arising in the mind, we just move the mind back to the intended object. So I'm not saying that approach is like bad or wrong or worse than that. It's just you don't find that particular instruction from Tibetan teachers.
Okay.
So yeah, the instruction in this tradition is just as soon as the mind shifts into a distraction, then we recollect the intended object.
My question is, what is it in meditation, right? We keep bringing the mind back all the time, all the time. And I'm to understand there will be a point where it will just trust and it will just, rest and not be so active.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand that whole point of like when the mind just becomes very calm and not jumping around any longer, but just calm. You talked about wisdom. Like, is that when I get really, it sounds so cryptic when teachers talk about this, like the wisdom comes, like what is supposed to be coming?
Mm-hmm. So when for example, if we take a particular example from the Lamrim, one of the early topics of the Lamrim is called precious human rebirth or perfect human rebirth. And there are 18 qualities of a perfect human rebirth that are presented. There are what are called the freedoms, which are negative, harmful, or disadvantageous states that we could be experiencing, and Buddhism would suggest that we have experienced in past lives, but that presently we're not experiencing. So we're free from some things that are disadvantageous. We're also endowed with positive things, things that are beneficial, supportive, very helpful in creating the kind of life that is extremely well suited to spiritual growth and development, which is the idea of perfect human rebirth. So it is a subset of human rebirth. Not all humans even have a perfect or a precious human rebirth. Some humans are deeply oppressed in one way, by incredible suffering, and therefore don't have the spaciousness of mind to really apply themselves to spiritual growth because they are in a war zone, or they're preoccupied with just trying to figure out how to get food, how to be safe, how not to die. And that preoccupation, that oppression, is an obstacle. It's not, of course, no one's saying that like everything is hopeless. It could change, that could stop, it could go away. And even within it, there are certainly, there's things, but comparatively speaking, you would ideally not be in a war zone. You would ideally not be singularly focused on where's my next meal coming from. That those are obstacles. So the 18 qualities, so for one, like the wisdom of listening would be being able to memorize the 18 qualities and being able to recollect, these are the freedoms, these are the endowments, and just being able to rattle them off, just due to familiarity. That's important. You need to be able to get to the point where you can tick through, all of the 18. And that takes time, just by listening, by reading, by studying. But, we've all memorized things. You can certainly get to a point where you know what the freedoms and the endowments are. But then in meditation, you are thinking about, yes, I have this freedom, I have this freedom, I have this freedom, I have this endowment, I have this endowment, I have this endowment. And ultimately, in an analytical meditation, there are kind of two stages. There's that active contemplation or analyzing part, where you're literally ticking through these 18, and you may not do all 18 in a single session, because it might take a long time, and you might not have, the session might be too long for it to be practical. So you might just do the freedoms, and then you might take a break, and then you might do the endowments. But ultimately, whatever the topic is, it has this active phase where you're recognizing it's true, it's valid to say that I myself possess this freedom, this freedom, this endowment, this endowment. And that is meant to give rise to a felt kind of, I always use the word visceral, kind of a really felt, something that's beyond intellectual, something that's a really felt insight that I myself am in possession of a perfect human rebirth. This thing that's incredibly valuable, this thing that so many sentient beings are not in possession of. But in this moment, I myself really validly am in possession of it. And like, how extraordinary, how amazing is that is true about my life. So that's kind of where because with the active phase, it's true you don't want to be going off into, what's for dinner, this fight that I had with this other, you want to stay on course, you want to stay within 18 qualities, but your mind is moving from this to then this to then this. So your mind is just discursive, they would say. Your mind it's not distracted in the sense that some other topic is arising, but it isn't fully resting at that point. It when you generate the actual insight that okay, I've looked at all of these 18 and I've directly observed that they characterize my life, then you have this felt sense of I have a perfect human rebirth. And that's extraordinary. I can do whatever I want with that. Mhm.
So when you're talking about analytical meditation, um, in the perspective of using the Lam Rim, then when you are looking at one of the topics, such as perfect human rebirth and all the subcategories, that's when you're sitting down on your cushion, you're in your mind, and you are like, I guess now this is what I also really wondered and never had the opportunity to get it answered. Like you were just talking about, are you thinking in your head, oh, just like you said, oh, how fortunate I am that I am living in a safe country. Like, are you
Mhm.
kind of narrating a story? Is that what the analytical of um precious human rebirth is? Is you're like narrating all the points and you're just until it becomes like solid, oh yes, okay, I completely get it, I have a perfect rebirth.
Yeah, it really is kind of like a specialized form of thinking. It's not something mystical. It's not something like esoteric. What is the only way in which it's different than thinking is that when we're just kind of contemplating, we haven't given ourselves the instruction not to indulge in distraction. When we're just kind of reading a book or we're just kind of contemplating, the mind, we don't bring the mind back necessarily. We might do that for a little bit and then we will go do something else. Really, the only difference between like sitting and just sort of thinking about how amazing it is that I have a perfect human rebirth. Of course, there's a posture of meditation and, which is helpful in terms of the posture is a very stable, posture that we try to get into because there's a relaxation response that happens in the body when the mind reaches the deeper levels of concentration. And so we train in a posture so that when that happens, we don't flop over. That we train in that from the beginning so that when that relaxation response happens, the body just stays where we put it, which is helpful. You don't want the body, you don't want to just be falling over in your meditation. That wouldn't be good. But in the beginning, it's just sort of training so that eventually the body can relax very deeply, and yet it's just sort of hanging on its own skeleton in a way. It's just kind of it's sort of your the body can fall into place without literally falling over. So there is a posture that goes along with meditation. But it's really just that when we've decided, oh, I'm going to do a 10-minute session of meditation, then we are very clearly saying, when distraction arises, I will notice the distraction. I will not follow the distraction, of course, as best we can, because we know that in the beginning, we don't notice the distraction until it's been percolating for a minute or 2 minutes. And then we're like, oh, for the last 2 minutes, I've been thinking about this thing that happened. And then we go back, but ultimately we want to, as soon as the distraction arises, move the mind back and not a minute later, 2 minutes later. But really, there's nothing you can do about that except repetition. Giving yourself that instruction and then doing your best to follow through on the instruction. The mind just kind of over time gets with the program. It kind of figures out what you're telling it and it will do it sort of automatically. But you can't force that process. You can't make it go faster. You can't white knuckle it. You can just give yourself the instruction and then engage in effort, and then your mind will figure out what you're trying to do, and it will kind of do it. Kind of like muscle memory, but for the mind, in a way. So it is thinking. It's not some kind of like weird thing that we don't know how to do or that we're not already doing. It's just that it's bounded by the decision, I'm only going to stay on this topic. So it is definitely true that we populate our individual meditations with our own experiences and our own examples. So, you know, if a person, you know, if so, if I'm meditating on rebirth and you're meditating on perfect human rebirth, I might have some individual examples that are unique to my own life, that are just things that I've experienced that demonstrate that point to me. You might have different examples, and that's fine. There's nothing, it's not like there's a list of, I mean, yes, you're supposed to think about, for example, that you're not presently experiencing an animal realm rebirth, right? Because the mind could have taken the form of a being in the animal realm. That mind is capable of that. There's nothing intrinsically human about consciousness. Consciousness can associate with different forms, and then sometimes consciousness incarnates in the body of an animal. And so when I'm thinking about that, the disadvantages that occur to my mind about that kind of rebirth might not be exactly the same disadvantages that you think about when you think about. We both ought to be thinking about the disadvantages, and because some people, like, they think, oh, how amazing it would be to be able to fly, or like, oh, whales must be, they're so peaceful, they're so graceful, or gazelles, or we sometimes romanticize the animal realm. So we're not supposed to do that. That's not, we shouldn't look at a gazelle and think, oh, they're so graceful. I mean, it's fine to appreciate, but not to want it for oneself, not to think, oh, I wish I could do that. I wish I had that. I wish I could run like a cheetah. Or that's wrong from the Buddhist perspective. But exactly the individual examples that I use and the individual examples that you use, they could be different. And as long as they are following the same general idea, then they're both perfectly valid. So it isn't like there's a list that you have to use only these examples. We definitely use them based on our own experiences. But there are boundaries. There are general ideas of this is in the boundary, this is outside the boundary. But if you're in the boundary, then it's fine. And even over time, your examples might change. You might have a particular experience, or based on, in years and years from now, based on something that you read, or something, some quotation that you came across might pop into your mind. Some particular line of a particular text might present something, and you might use that for a while, and then a different text, a different line might pop into your mind, and you might use that as the basis of contemplation for a while. So there are things that are in bounds and out of bounds, but there isn't, it's definitely, so we are actively thinking, and it's individual in the sense that, how long because we don't, as I said, there's 18 different qualities, right? So you can't spend like an hour on each one, right? So like how much time, you spend, that's kind of pretty individual, like how a person chooses to, how many examples or how much time, that's kind of personal to the individual. You shouldn't skip, any of the 18. You shouldn't just like ignore some of the teachings. But whether you spend 2 minutes or 4 minutes or 6 minutes, I don't know what happened.
Yeah,
That
you
was-
got frozen. You got frozen for a minute. Thank you so much. Can I ask you a question
Mhm.
as you're talking? So when I'm sitting, so I understand now with analytical meditation what that entails. It's like the Lam Rim. When I'm doing, is shamatha and vipassana the same? Like when I'm sitting down and I am watching my breath, is that vipassana in one, um, like maybe in Theravada and then shamatha in Mahayana? Like I don't know what I'm doing as I'm sitting down watching my breath.
Yeah, so um, the Vipassana in English translates into insight. So it's kind of a question of like, what is it that we're trying to gain insight into? And so in a way, like if we take the body, like for example, um, then if it's in a way, it kind of depends on what the goal is, what we're trying to, because like Vipassana from the Theravadan perspective, the goal is to kind of get deeply in touch or develop insight into the ever-changing nature of the body, the fact that this sensation is arising and now that sensation is arising and now there's pain here and then there's heat here. So it's helping us to not see the body as a monolithic thing, which is kind of how we normally relate to the body. We normally think of the body as like one thing, and it's not true. The body is comprised of many things, and if we, scan the body and kind of think about the weight of the body, the temperature of the body, the pain that's arising in the knee, the sensation of the air moving across the skin, then we're developing insight into the fact that the body is a combination of so many different things. And then that helps us to have a more balanced, a more realistic understanding or view of what we are, what actually is our identity, because so much of our identity is wrapped up in how we relate to the body, and thinking of it as like really truly me and something that's like unchanging, even though we age and so on. Still we always, even we kind of paper over all of those changes. We're not really good at being in deep contact with that changing nature. And that's not so much the focus in Mahayana. In Tibetan Buddhism, they don't. I mean, some people still will do that kind of meditation. It's not taught. It's not emphasized as much. The emphasis is more so, again, as I say, some people will do that. They will do that to some degree. But as I say, really, the Lam Rim is sort of what's presented as the essence of or the focal point of practice, trying to replicate the insights that the Buddha had is really the main essence. And the kind of insight, the way that a Mahayana practitioner would go about generating insight isn't so much focused on the change. I mean, of course, as I say, when you're doing impermanence, like then in that particular context, then you really might focus more so on vipassana of thinking of all of the changes that are happening in the body. That might be really supportive, but you also need to think about the mind as well, not just the body, but also the mind. And then you'd also need to think about external reality as well, all of the things that are separate from the body and mind. They're also in the nature of impermanence. But it certainly could be that when a person's focusing on that topic, then taking the body as the object and thinking about the impermanent nature of the body is quite important. It's just that it serves a slightly different purpose because we're also trying not to only cling at the body or the mind, but we're trying also not to cling to external things as well. So the real insight is that everything is in the nature of impermanence, and nothing, therefore, is something that we should regard as unchanging. And therefore, there's really nothing to cling to, because whatever we apprehend, it itself is changing moment by moment by moment. And our static view of it is a misapprehension. It's a wrong way of relating to it. And it gives rise to suffering. Mm-hmm.
So this is where I am in my meditation. I want to connect to what you just said, and I also want to understand. So shamatha that I'm doing, which is sitting down and bringing my mind back to my breath over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
And then the mind will eventually calm, because it does like maybe after 20 minutes or 15 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
it calms, right? So at that point, okay, does wisdom come, like, is my mind supposed to bring some wisdom that, I don't know, comes out of nowhere? Because I'm to understand, when I am doing shamatha meditation, no matter what comes up, you just keep bringing it to the breath, right? So that's one point. My second thought is that vipassana, because vipassana will focus on the body, and then shamatha takes it more in shamatha with the lam rim. It's, yes, body, but you're also thinking about these different subtopics. And the clinging, right? So we're reducing the clinging. My wondering is it possible, like, is it possible for the clinging to be reduced after we have the clinging? Like, I have the clinging with my friends, I have the clinging with my family, but when I go into the train, there is no clinging because I don't know them, right? And so there is no relationship formed. So is it really possible for me to not have the cling with my friends and family? Like, I don't know how to not have the cling. Like in the
Mm-hmm.
bus and the train, there is no cling. People come in and out, they come and go. I might have a conversation with some random person, but it's like very neutral. Goodbye, goodbye. And I don't have a cling of, oh, I want to see this person tomorrow, or I want to send a text. So can you
Mm-hmm.
please sort of support these two thoughts of mine?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of um, shamatha, in terms of that, is kind of a more global skill that we're trying to develop, that's ultimately beneficial regardless of what we're meditating on. So we use the breath as because um, no matter what we do, no matter what topic we're meditating on, it's true that we've given ourselves the instruction, right, to notice distraction, which means that we've decided this is in bounds and this is out of bounds. And when the mind is out of bounds, we bring the mind back in bounds. That's true for any meditation. So any meditation is helpful in developing the skill of concentrating the mind with quote unquote single pointedly, quote unquote, without distraction. Any meditation will help us to get to further our ability to get to that goal. But an object like the breath, in theory, if a person's doing 10 minutes of meditation, there's no intentional discursiveness at all in that 10 minutes if the object is the breath, because that sensation is present in the mind from the very first moment of that 10 minutes. And it now, of course, we breathe more slowly, the sensation changes, but we're meant to just stay present with that sensation as it is arising. So it's true at minute 10 versus minute 1, the sensation's not the same, but each second of that 10 minutes, the goal is to just notice what is present, what is arising. So in theory, a person could, if the object is the breath, have only the breath arising in the mind for 10 minutes. But if the object is precious human rebirth, you've got 18 different things arising in the mind, and you're doing that on purpose. That's not wrong. That's not distraction, right? Because that's all in bounds. That's what you've decided is the meditation, is all of those 18 things. So you're introducing intentional discursiveness, intentional movement or busyness of the mind, because it serves a separate important purpose. The fact that you're still noticing distraction and bringing the mind back is helping you to progress toward having a very calm, concentrated mind. But the breath is is an even better object for doing that, because you as the meditator are not bringing any intentional discursiveness into your meditation. Anything that arises in your mind that's not the present moment sensation of the breath is a distraction. So anything, whether it's a kind thought or an angry thought, it's all a distraction. None of it is, because it's not the breath. And the breath doesn't have to be generated. The breath is simply there. If you are alive, you are breathing. Whereas the goal of analytical meditation is to give rise to an insight that requires time and requires analysis to generate. And so it's a person, a meditator, a practitioner should ideally be including sessions of, single pointed meditation like the breath, and analytical meditations where you're following a chain of logic, a chain of reasoning, a chain of argumentation that's giving rise to an insight. Now, certainly there are insights that we gain by doing breathing meditation. Of course, we develop, without choice, we develop an insight about how our mind works, and how the mind can skillfully move back, from how we don't have to, over time, simply by noticing distraction and bringing the mind back, we realize we don't have to energize everything that pops into our mind. That's a wisdom. Like, that's something that we've gained direct experience with, even if it's just the breath that's the object. We've now noticed, before, I felt like this thought was so solid, so important, so powerful, that it would take me on a journey, in my mind, and I had to energize that. But I've learned I can just let it go. I can just bring the mind back. And that is an insight that translates into our daily life, that bleeds over, into when thoughts are arising, when negative thoughts, when thoughts that we don't want, that is a training that will bleed over into that. That's a skill that we're developing. So it's certainly true that we are still developing insights, even if it's just breathing meditation. To your question about how, the topic that you're bringing about in terms of attachment or clinging, it's a huge topic, and Buddhism would say that it's very deeply ingrained, into our psyche, this idea, because our friends, our family, as opposed to those strangers that you're talking about, our friends, our family, they're they're doing things that we like, right? They're saying kind things, they're doing kind things most of the time, not all of the time, but most on balance. They're supporting us, they're being, they're saying nice things. They agree with a lot of the things that we agree with. Um, and we are attracted to that. We want to be around that. Whereas the people that, support political views that we find reprehensible, or we don't want to be around that. Like, we want to be separate from those people. And strangers are just people who we're not sure about yet, right? They haven't demonstrated kindness to us, and they also haven't demonstrated that they hold, like, really, they're not Nazis. They haven't said that they support, Nazi ideology and genocide, and things that we would just be like, get away from me, that's gross, I don't want to be around you. If they did say that, if the person got on the train and they were wearing, Nazi paraphernalia, we would get up and we would change, we'd get up and to go in the next, we'd like, no, that we would have a strong reaction. So the strength of our reaction is really, from the Buddhist perspective, again, a function of self-grasping and self-cherishing. It is, I like being around people that support me, that agree with me, that say kind things, that do kind things. If I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not, then I can kind of take or leave those people. They can sit down next to me and we can sort of have some pleasantries, and then they can go along, but if they start saying, oh, that's an amazing book, that you're reading, I just read that, you can get engrossed in like a really deep conversation. Then you'll get that person's number, you'll call them, and then you'll be like best friends, right? Because they've demonstrated that they see things the way that you do. They agree with your worldview, you have all kinds of things in common, and you really want to be around that kind of energy that feels good. And so dealing with that is a major focus of Buddhist philosophy, but it's incredibly difficult. Buddhism doesn't have quick fixes for anything, unfortunately. But we can, through analytical meditation, we can try to have a fuller, more realistic view of people. And we can think, well, it isn't valid that just because someone is kind, that I should be willing to benefit them. And if a person's unkind, I should want to give rise, I should want them to come to harm. Because there are people that love that person. There are times when they are kind. We don't get along with them. They don't agree with our worldview. Or we've had individual interactions that we didn't find pleasant, but that isn't reasonable or valid as a basis for saying that that person is not on equal footing with someone that is kind to us. So we can use analytical meditation to see through the stories that we're telling ourselves that don't really make sense, that aren't really in line or in tune with what's true about people. But it's so difficult. It isn't we will do that, just like anger, just like all of these things. You'll get angry, and then you'll go home and you'll do a meditation, sending positive thoughts to that person and so on. And then the next day you're going to get angry again. That it's not like that one meditation is going to fix that deeply integrated, not so great habit. But a lifetime of meditation on patience, a lifetime on meditation on trying to see people in their totality, rather than have they been kind to me, have they not been kind to me, thinking, well, they have fears, they have aspirations, they're somebody's mother, they're somebody's sister. they have bad days just like I do. They have good days. And when they have good days, they are nicer to people, just like I am nicer to people when I'm having a good day. You know, we have to, this idea of familiarizing the mind with virtue is a lifelong process. It's not, it doesn't have an end date. I kind of think of, spirituality in the same way that I think of, health. It's kind of like it's like a real mental health, which doesn't, just like you can't say, oh, well, I'm going to eat salad for a while and then I'm going to be done with that because I'm fixed now. That's not true. Like if you start going and eating badly again, your health is going to deteriorate, right? You have to eat healthy every single day for your entire life to maintain your physical health. And we have to familiarize our mind with virtue every single day in order to maintain our mental health, in order to relate to people in a positive, constructive, beneficial way. It isn't something that we can just stop doing. Yeah.
So, for example, when anger does arise or frustration, what I'm getting from you is we bring into the mind virtue, and virtue is, think of them that reflect that they are someone's sister or mother or brother, and the mother, brother, sister have had positive experiences with them, and that the fact that I've had a negative experience with this person does not justify me having negative thoughts towards them. So it's like canceling out the negative thought about that person. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's basically like, what story am I telling myself about this person? And can I tell myself a different story that's going to support a different way of being in relation to them? Because the story that we're telling ourselves is that, they did it on purpose in order, that they're a bad person, they're a terrible person. They intentionally, they wanted me to suffer in some way. We spiral on all of these stories, and they don't have no basis in reality. Now, it could be that there are some people who really, in a very stable way, struggle with like being short-tempered. There are certainly people that are like that very often, in a stable way, they they're just, they have a short fuse, and things get on their nerves and they react, and we're like that's just how they are, and that's true. But that person also is going to die, right? Who they are isn't what they're familiar with now, right? So their mind, right now, we can say, sure, it certainly seems like in many different situations with many different people, still they have a pretty stable way of behaving that causes a lot of conflict, that causes a lot of, animosity between people. They're not easy to get along with. There's certainly people that are like that it's not like, we can't validly say that it's just me. Like they relate to that way with a lot of people, but still we can try to see them as a suffering sentient being, um, someone who right now is really struggling with a particular affliction, like being short-tempered or being, some people are greedy, some people, like, it's never enough, they need to always hoard things, or they're always talking about buying more, or that people do certainly have really stable ways of relating that aren't so positive, um, and that it can even cause conflict or strife in their relationships with others. But it's what we can do is separate even a really, really stable way of behaving with who they are intrinsically, who they are in a really deep way, because they've had past lives, they're going to have future lives. And all we're saying is that right now, for this few years, they're struggling with a particular thing that is kind of causing some chaos, in their life. And we can just take that take that person as an object of compassion and think, that must really be terrible, that repeatedly they want to connect with others, they want to have, loving relationships, but they struggle so much with being short-tempered or with whatever it is, that again and again they're prevented from kind of getting, and just think that must be awful, that must really be painful. It's painful for other people, it's painful for them. And so we can wish that person well. We can still think, may they be free of that. May what they're struggling with be lifted from their mind. May they no longer be under the influence of this thing that they can't seem to get a handle on. May that not be their experience, because that's beneficial for them and it's beneficial for everybody else, because there's serial killers and there's all kinds of, but if we think, well, they're a serial killer from their own, like intrinsically, like that's who they are, then that means that they've always been a serial, that in every other life that they've ever had, they were, and it means that there will be a serial killer in every future life. And that's not true. That's not a valid statement. It's just things have come together in a particular lifetime, and they have a really chaotic, painful way, a detrimental, harmful way of being in relation to other people that they would love to not be doing. That if they could be rid of that, that would be amazing. So when we see that, we can think it's not really who they intrinsically are. It's just a surface level, stable, painful way that they are manifesting right now. And all I wish for them is that that's not true for their experience. And then, we're free from a judgmental mind, from a mind that is responding to harm with harm, because there's nothing we can really do. Like if they are short-tempered, we're not going to make them be patient. We're not going to, they're probably going to, of course, if they're open to it, we can be like, hey, I'm going to this class, it's really helpful. Do you want to come along? And maybe they can get some interest, and that's great. Maybe that could be, but it could also be that they're going to go the whole rest of their life and being short-tempered. So it's kind of up to us, because that negative judgmental mind that can't stand to be around them, that wishes them to be harmed, that isn't, because we may have to interact with them. They may be in our orbit, they may be, and some people are. And so it's beneficial for oneself if we can just think, how awful it is that that's how they're going through life. And we're engaging, we're thinking, when I achieve enlightenment, may I be the one to lead them to their enlightenment, so that they can be completely free of that painful way of being in relation to others. Or may some teacher, or may someone come into their life who can present things in a particular way and help them to see a different way of, and that doesn't mean that we force them to become Buddhist, or but we just we hope and we pray that things change for them, that their situation becomes different. And that's such a more pleasant way of being around them, because then it's not about us. We're reducing that self-grasping and that self-cherishing that only previously thought, I find this intolerable for me. This is harmful for me. We think that's harmful for them and how terrible it is for them. And then we can kind of open our hearts to the experience that they're having and how painful that is for them. And then when we're around them, we can be the recipient of that, and we can be holding our mind in that state of compassion. We can be absorbed into compassion rather than absorbed into, I find what they are doing intolerable for my interest, my desire to not be experiencing this. Because they are experiencing this, and how awful it is that they are experiencing this. So we're kind of flipping. But again, I mean, all of this is our life's practice. This is all, yeah.
So is this because there's just a vast amount of meditation practices and techniques I am learning, I
Mhm.
now get a better understanding of what analytical is. I get a better understanding of what shamatha and vipassana is. So then there's that, like we're just talking about this right now, and I hear, okay, then you sit down on your cushion and you do like a loving kindness meditation. So
Mhm.
if someone has angered you, no, let me take that back. If anger has arisen within you and you have um reacted in a way that was not, you were out of control, then, or that person was out of control, then do you sit down on your cushion and you do like um a meditation about a loving kindness, like you give love to yourself and how that feels, and then you, because you have, your mother on one side, maybe your
Mhm.
friend on the other, and your enemy and friend, and then you give love and compassion and kindness to yourself, and think of like something that you did that gave you an immense amount of joy, you know what I'm saying, and then you give
Mhm.
that joy to your friend and your mom and the person. So is that like what we should do? Because somehow I'm understanding that whatever we do in meditation should be transferring into our daily life. Like our
Mhm.
daily life is our practice. Like sitting down is good, but then at the same time, we have lives. We cannot separate it. So
Mhm.
I'm also at the junction of I sit and I am, doing shamatha, or I use the lam rim to do this contemplation. But then when I get out of my cushion, like I have to apply awareness. So when we're all talking about mindfulness and awareness, like you talk about, an affliction comes about, right? Like a disturbing emotion comes, then I bring myself, as I'm practicing a meditation, and you were talking, oh, they're just like thoughts. They don't have power over me. I know how to bring myself back to the present, to my breath. I bring myself back to feeling my footstep. What do I see? What do I smell? What do I hear? So is this what, how I'm supposed to be transforming myself?
Definitely the purpose of, so the value of meditation is that we can set aside time and space in our day where we are intentionally kind of separating ourselves from the busyness of the mind. We're telling people like, don't bother me, don't knock on the door, like, this is my meditation time. So we are carving out time to focus the mind. Um, and, but that those familiar, so we're creating then new habits, new tendencies, new habituations, new familiarizations, um, by spending 20 minutes, single pointed, quote unquote, single pointedly, generating loving kindness. Um, the idea is that if we do that enough, that it becomes our baseline state, that it becomes that everything that we say and that we think and that we do in the world is simply a reflection of what we are most familiar with. If we're most familiar with going through the world needing everyone to say nice things and do nice things and never say anything unkind and never interfere with our interests, and we have this view that everybody should be like that, and then we're going to be offended a lot. We're going to be angry a lot. We're going to be kind of fragile. We're going to, you know, but if we can give ourselves time and space to engage in formal practice, the only purpose of that is that eventually it bleeds over, as I say. And we're also meant to think of all of the rest of our life as informal practice, as you're saying. So there's formal practice where we're sitting on the cushion, where we've tried to, not have things, we've put the dog away and we've told people to be quiet, and, we're giving ourselves the best possible external conditions to concentrate the mind. But then we do go off and there is, people are saying and doing things. And so we're supposed to try to notice what is the gulf between the ideal that I cultivated in meditation and my actual response in daily life. What is the separation between those two things? Like when I meditated on love, I had, I was absorbed, I had these really great feelings. I was able to say the right things and feel the right things. And I did, and then when the rubber hit the road and that person, told me, they said the unkind thing, none of that happened. Like I didn't do any of that. So we noticed that there's this big disconnect between those two things. And eventually we just try to narrow that disconnect by we're not going to quickly be able to get to the point where in the moment we did say the right thing, or we did feel the right thing, or we did do the right thing. But we can get to a point where instead, for one, we want to get to a point where we label the not so great response as a not so great response. Because in the past, we were happy that we were angry. We felt like being angry was sticking up for ourselves. We thought that flipping them off and, giving them a bad look, we thought that was like good, that we should have done that. That was useful. But really it wasn't useful. It was painful for oneself. And it didn't help us to, the other person now even thinks less well of us than before. So it really just perpetuated all kinds of suffering. We injured them and we injured ourselves. So by even in meditation, we change that sort of worldview. And that's very helpful, where we're labeling that which is bad as that which is bad. That's that which we should no longer do as that which, because in the past we rejoiced that we engaged. We felt like, oh yeah, I told that guy off, and and we tell our friends, and we're like, yeah, and we're high-fiving, and we're, and now we're like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. And that's a profound, being able to do that is a profoundly beneficial change in how we're relating to things. But then we can get to the point where, yeah, I'm
But
gonna have to I'm gonna have to go in just a minute, but I'm
okay.
sorry.
No, but in our culture, it's all about clap back. Like if you don't clap back, then you're weak, right? So
Mhm.
that's kind of like, I think, a hard thing to balance, right? Or if you don't stand up for yourself, then like in a work situation, then you're weak. Like it's
Mhm.
kind of a fine line, and it's something I struggle with, like because the view in Western culture is not of in like, for example, Buddhist perspective, you may not say, like, not saying anything is, it speaks volumes to your wisdom.
Mhm.
I know no one's thinking that. They're just like, she didn't clap back, or she didn't stand up for herself. So um that's one of the things that I struggle with. And like, I guess when you dive into Lamrim and you go through all the subtopics, still I think I'm missing, like, that's different from when, we sit on our cushion and we radiate loving compassion to others. Um, does that cover in the lam like, when an afflicting emotion comes up, is there something in the lam that we go right to, right? And then, that's where the disturbing emotion comes, and then we sit down and we think about it and we generate. I guess I'm not really understanding how shamatha and lamrim is coming together, or are they completely different things? And then how I imply it into
Mhm.
my daily life.
So the a person would train in a single pointed concentration because as a skill, it makes analytical meditation more effective. Um, a person uses the breath as an object, takes that as an object, because it's very well suited to helping them to deeply remain on the object. And so when we're meditating on, because even if we are meditating on love, there's all kinds of distractions arising, right? And it's not a very stable insight that we're generating because the mind is going to all of these other objects. If we can, and there's nine, I don't know if you've come across like the teachings on calm abiding, the 9 levels of calm abiding, if we can make progress on developing fully qualified calm abiding, that is such a profoundly calm and tranquil and focused mind that when we have that mind all of the time, we develop, that becomes the nature of the mind, is a mind that's qualified by calm abiding. And so whatever we're meditating on, we now have that ability. And so whether it's karma or whether it's impermanence, those insights, they sink down into the mind in a way that's impossible with a mind that's not as concentrated, with a mind that's not as stable and still. So progressing through the levels of concentration is beneficial for anything that we want to meditate on. So this idea of the insight bleeding over, if we can really make progress on concentration, then when we meditate on anything, it is imbued into it's like the mind is manifesting into that insight in such a deep way, then the probability that it will impact our daily life is infinitely greater. So that's why it's really important that we try, and of course, all meditations help us to progress toward fully qualified calm abiding, but that's why it's such an important goal to try to, because everything that we do is so much more effective, so much more powerful with that mind. The mind that we have now is weak. Our concentration is weak, and so the impact of our meditations is unfortunately not that great, which is why we have to repeat it so often. But a person who has fully qualified Khamabadings, their meditations are just so powerful. Lama Yeshe says it's like putting atomic bombs on the afflictions when you have this mind of calm abiding, because you become, your familiarity is so incredibly strong. The afflictions are powerless. They just can't arise because your mind is one with loving kindness. Your mind is one with compassion and patience and generosity. And so impatience and miserliness and ill will, they just don't stand any chance. If your mind is in the nature of generosity, if your mind is in the nature of loving kindness, then those opposing problematic states, they have no ground to stand on. They can't get a foothold in the mind. But I'm sorry, I'm getting picked up.
Yes,
So,
yes,
but
yes,
hopefully you'll come back next Friday.
yes. Oh my gosh, this has been the best class ever. Honestly, you have solved so many of my issues. I feel so, so joyful. Thank you so much, Venerable. Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Have a good night.